hosted between myself and Emma. So Emma, give us another wave there. Emma runs our Wildlife Champions program. So I'm sure you've probably seen, well, you wouldn't have seen those champions. We've seen that some of our lovely champions have attended this evening. And then I have been running the Team Wilder Ecological Advisory Service. Our project is wrapping up in the end of, the start of spring in March. So we're doing these presentations really to sort of fill some knowledge gaps that we've identified from our service users. So without further ado, this presentation specifically will be discussing the sort of various legal ways in which wildlife is protected at the national and international scale. If I'm speaking too fast or anything, Emma, if anybody pops it into the chat, Emma, just tell me to slow down, because it can be quite chunky. So we're going to start talking about species, notable species for the first half. And like Alex said, we're going to take a 5-minute break. And then in the second half, we'll talk about landscapes and habitats. So notable species are species that are protected by law due to their restricted populations, essentially. They may also be notable because they have specific ecosystem benefits. They may be keystone species of habitats or maybe indicators of ecosystem health. But primarily it is because they were once common and now are less so. Sometimes notable species can be referred to as Section 41 species. That refers to the sort of legal section in the legislation that protects them. Or they can be referred to as species of principal importance or just nationally scarce species. And all of these terms have possibly slightly different specific designations, but all refer to these sort of notable species. They are protected in national law under the Wildlife Countryside Act. That is our main piece of legislation in the UK that functions to protect our notable species and priority habitats. But some of those species also benefit from additional legislative protection under the EU Habitats Directive. After Brexit, we did keep a lot of these European protected species legislation, and we'll go a little bit more into that. But yeah, essentially the many laws in the UK that protect wildlife generally focus on protecting them from killing, injury, or taking of the species from the wild. But also sometimes for particular species that can also extend to protecting their resting sites, their foraging areas, and the wider habitats that they rely upon as well. So the most commonly encountered type of notable species is the European Protected Species, or EPS. I'll refer to them as EPS, just because it can get quite wordy otherwise. And under the European legislation, there's around 1,300 protected species, and that doesn't include fungi, plants, or birds, as they have their own legislations, and over 230 habitat types. So it's really extensive, and it's supposed to be a real catch-all. But common European species in the UK, or EPS in the UK, we don't have that whole 1,300 plus. We have restricted populations, partly due to our geography, and also because of our sort of behaviours with how we've treated those species in the past. But yeah, common EPS in the UK include beavers, otters, hazel dormice, all 17 of our native bat species, great crested newts, and natterjack toads. But that's not sort of all of the notable species in the UK. If we talk about notable species, including those that have UK specific protection, that can extend to all of our amphibians and reptiles, our badgers. Technically all of our mammals receive protection under the Protection of Mammals Act, or the Mammals Act, sorry. They're protected from intentional harm and killing. But yes, other sort of notable species could include badgers, water voles, and European eels. Some species like eels are migratory, which we'll kind of touch on in a little bit as well. So they're also protected under additional migratory legislation, and badgers have got their own whole act, the Protection of Badgers Act. So yeah, it really varies, but essentially the key thing to take away is most of our wildlife, native wildlife, receives some sort of protection from harm or killing. So I'm going to go through a couple of pictures here. Hopefully this part of my presentation plays ball. Just going to go through a couple of pictures of different European protected species and just give a couple of facts about them to give you an idea of the variety of population sizes or distributions that they have. So firstly, we've got some great horseshoe bats roosting in a cave. Great horseshoes are the UK's largest bat, and they are now only distributed in the southwest of the country. So we're really lucky in Avon to have quite a lot of great horseshoe bat roosts. That's mostly due really to the fact we've got some really great cave systems, sort of leftovers from our mining history in the Mendips, around Bath and Box mines, over in South Wales and in Cornwall and Devon. So that's a really valuable species that we've got here. They number between sort of projections are around 9 to 18,000 species in the entire UK. So really not particularly numerous. Next, we've got beavers. So Emma is our resident beaver fanatic at the Wildlife Trust. So really, you should be presenting this one, Emma, but you've not got my notes. So beavers were once a common sight in the UK for millennium, until gradually they were hunted to extinction for their oils and fur mainly, until around 400 years ago when they went extinct. In that intervening period, we straightened our rivers from wide, wiggly floodplains into straight, deep rivers. We dried out our wetlands and drained our farmlands significantly, which massively reduced the variety in our wild environments. But luckily, the first legal beaver reintroduction was in 2002 in Kent, and beavers are known as these iconic habitat engineers, ecosystem engineers, that really reverse a lot of those negative trends I just mentioned. And now nationally, well, across the whole UK, we have possibly between 1,500 and 2,500 beavers living in the wild. And locally in Avon, we have 13 known beaver families, even though they've only been known to be around here for under 5 years. So that's pretty cool. Next up, we've got greater crested newts, a very well-known species that are pretty widely distributed across lowland England, but their numbers and range have been declining sharply. Greater crested newts are a really important species in our food webs for many other animals as a food, for birds, fish, and small mammals, and their declines are often symbolic of the intensification of agriculture and loss of ponds in our wider landscapes, which is why, at least at my advisory service, if I can recommend you get a pond into your garden or community space or local park, that's really the number one thing you can do for wildlife. Next, we've got another bat. I've just included this little common pipistrelle because unlike the great horseshoes, which can, like I said, number under 20,000 at the absolute max, common pipistrelles number upwards of 3 million individuals. So you can imagine the ecological service that this species is providing in terms of pest control is massive, since each bat can eat around 3,000 flies, midges, and mosquitoes a night. So next time you're on a nice summer's evening, you can see them flitting about, give them a little thank you because they're working very hard for us. I've got a couple oddballs here. I've got a bottlenose dolphin and a green turtle. I've included these two marine mammals because sometimes they can be forgotten as these really important UK visitors with their globally migratory lifestyles, but they do frequent our waters to feed. I don't know if anybody's seen the stunning footage of humpback whales and bluefin tuna that have also been visiting British waters over the last couple of years. But these two specific species, the dolphin and the turtle, are additionally protected against poaching through CITES regulation. But when they're in our legal waters, they do benefit from our additional wildlife protections. I'll whiz through quickly. I've also popped a large blue butterfly in here just to remind us about the importance of invertebrates and how protected invertebrates are equally as important and deserving of protection as our more enigmatic species. These are not our only pollinators, as I'm sure many of you are aware, but the ecological status of a habitat can often actually be monitored by really sort of accurately just by the presence or absence and abundance of the invertebrates found there. Large blue butterflies themselves were actually announced extinct in 1979, but as a result of really successful reintroductions, they can be found in the UK again. So that's a nice sort of positive story. Which it can be hard to focus on the positives when you're looking at species declines and, you know, loss of protected habitats or important habitats. So remember the large blue. And it wouldn't be my presentation if I didn't end on some sort of toad or frog. So I'm going to end on my favourite UK species, the natterjack toad. These cute little guys have just 3 remaining highly restricted populations in sort of Dorset, Merseyside and Norfolk areas. And they live in these really sort of delicate sand dune ecosystems. They're a really enigmatic species. If you think they're enigmatic like I do, they're known for their beautiful golden eyes, and they make these really sort of quintessentially froggy, noisy calls in their mating season. So yes, maybe you weren't aware of natterjack toads. I wish we had them in our gardens a little bit more, but I do also love our common toad as well, of course. You may also be aware of some of these species getting quite a bit of flack in our media for holding up development. I've included this because this is really a key function of their protection, as the legislation that protects them demands the appropriate protection from harm and mitigation for impacting their access to food or their habitats, or, you know, protection from direct harm. And without these protections, it would be essentially legal to kill these species or restrict their habitats or destroy their homes. So luckily in the UK, we do have really good legislation on sort of when you compare to other countries in the world. And for the most part, our legislation works really well to ensure this isn't the case. Just on that sort of mildly development related point as well, I've included a protected species survey calendar by a consultancy called Place Services. And as you can see from this example, each of these protected species have got their own seasonal behaviours that may be protected, like disturbance during hibernation, for example, with our bats, even though, you know, bats are actually protected the whole year round, but there is additional considerations during their hibernation period compared to when they're a lot more active. Or maybe with other species like badgers, their feeding zones are also protected, or their shelters. So balancing the mitigation of each of these species, particularly when you have different ones on the same site alongside the other human priorities, can cause massive delays if things aren't able to be done at the right time. So now, after that, I know it's only been sort of 15 minutes, but I have talked at you about quite a lot. I'm just going to give you 5 minutes for either just a brain rest or to grab a cup of tea. And if anybody has got any questions that they've already raised, we can take a couple of like small questions in this interim break. But otherwise, if people want to come back at like 20 past, then that just gives us a few minutes to digest all of that legislation before we go into habitats. Great. Okie dokes. So carrying on, this second half, we're going to talk more about priority habitats. So that we've covered species, but obviously species exist within habitats, and some habitats really, I was talking to my volunteer about this yesterday, really most things are habitats. So without going sort of really deep into the nitty gritty of the fact that, you know, technically a garage is a habitat to a mouse, or, you know, a windowsill is a habitat to a ladybird in the case of my flat. We're going to be specifically talking about priority habitats. So thinking more about those naturalistic habitats. Obviously, also some people will be aware that a lot of our countryside and our natural spaces are still quite heavily managed. But when we talk about priority habitats, we're talking about predefined habitats that are sort of specifically defined by their constituent species, such as native woodlands, hedgerows, intertidal mudflats, specialist fungi grasslands. But technically, priority habitats in the eyes of the law are also listed under that same Section 41 of the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act. So you don't really need to worry too much about the acronym, but just Section 41 is your main mechanism, because that is what lists those priority habitats. And as with the species, they've got a couple of different names they may be referred to, but generally it's priority habitats or habitats of principal importance. This sort of quite wordy list I've just included because that is the exhaustive list. And you'll notice on the left, there's sort of these broader categories like broadleaf woodland or littoral sediments. Those are the broad categories. And then each of those is followed by a more specific habitat that comes under that umbrella, all of which have their own definition of factors that define them. And this may include the geology, the altitude, the constituent animal or plant species, the rainfall or other biological factors, and public bodies like local authorities or sort of national governments, devolved governments, they all do have a responsibility to conserve the biodiversity of these habitats. Often councils will designate these habitats in their regions as sites of nature conservation interest or local wildlife sites. And it's the strength of having a network of these sites that's really important for nature, on top of the value of the individual habitats themselves. So how do landscape designations function to protect wildlife? There are several scales of protection in place to protect wildlife and the sites and habitats that they exist in. This does depend on the species or the habitat that lives there and their sort of local, regional, national or international importance. And as we'll go over shortly, different levels of legal protections function to, in theory, dissuade or discourage negative impacts to these areas. But in reality, we know that things can be much more complicated. And we know that sometimes wildlife sites can still suffer damage, whether that's sort of intentionally through fly tipping or more systemically, where maybe local authorities may have to change their priorities for landscape designation. But I guess it's really important to remember that landscape designations are not the end of the process, and they're not really supposed to be a stagnant, not a static process. You know, things are being additionally designated all over the country, or undesignated or redesignated. And we've also seen the institution of new designations over the last few years. And people power can be really effective in protecting wildlife sites and getting new sites recognised. So we'll touch on this a little bit later. But for now, buckle up, because unfortunately for everyone, we are going on an acronym adventure. You'll see that although I'm using lots of acronyms, it is because using the whole terms just means that it's all gobbledygook. So I've put the full term and the abbreviation next to it. But with use and with time, hopefully that these different acronyms will mean a lot more to you. That's sort of the hope of this presentation, is that all these different ways of referring to natural spaces, there is logic behind it. So in the UK, there are UK designations are chosen by government bodies of each devolved nation. And in this case, we're just looking at England. But the management of designated sites is usually done by whoever owns them. And this can be a council, maybe a farm or a private landowner, an ENGO like a wildlife trust. There's lots of different people who can be responsible for them, and there is an expectation to keep them in good condition, but this can be really difficult with financial limits, differing government priorities, or poor enforcement often being an issue. So anyway, we're going to start at the top with our sort of more local designations, and then we'll work down through national and then international designations. And then I've got sort of an overlaid map where I'll show you each one and how they layer on top of each other to sort of note different areas of those international importance versus those of local importance. So starting with SNCI'S, of sites of nature conservation interest, or local wildlife sites. Nice and confusingly, to start us off, different counties will use either of these designation names, but they essentially both equate to the same thing. They are designated by the local authority, so that might be Bristol Council, Baines Council, North Somerset, or South Gloss in our case. And they are designated to recognise areas of local importance for wildlife and for geological value. They can contain any priority habitat or notable species, and they are a tool contributing to local biodiversity action plans, which are essentially documents that local councils will use when they're planning their infrastructure and developments. Moving down to national level, there's a few different ones that come under national, but local nature reserves, they are similar to those sorts of county designations, but they are harder for local authorities to reverse the designation on due to government involvement in their designation. So local nature reserves are for people and wildlife. Again, they do apply to wildlife or geological features, but they are those that are of special interest locally. So that might be, historic mining operations in the area, or maybe a really old geological feature that may support ponds or interesting wildlife. Next is our SSSI'S, which is probably one of the more commonly referred to national designations. That's our sites of special scientific interest. These are designated by the government, and there is a responsibility by landowners to maintain them to a favourable condition, like I mentioned earlier. Now, unfortunately, in the UK currently, our SSSI network is in overall decline. And I found some stats the other day that said in 2023, only around a third of all of our SSSI'S were rated as favourable condition, about 36%. And only 16% of these in the care of water companies were rated as good condition this year. Similarly, only about 15% in control of national park authorities were rated good either. But luckily, we do have some ENGOs out there working hard to reverse these trends, with 58% of SSSI'S in RSPB hands being rated as good condition, and the Environment Agency also maintaining it just over 80% of their SSSI'S in good condition, as we should expect. So not all bad news. It's also really important to remember that SSSI condition is a complex issue again, and degradation is often due to a lot of contributing factors, which can be sort of funding, ownership disputes, outdated sort of payment schemes, or poor enforcement and lack of support from local authorities. Although it is only fair to recognise that the overall trend is essentially due to sort of a systemic neglect. Moving cheerfully onto our national nature reserves. I appreciate a lot of this wording sounds quite similar, but yeah, national nature reserves were established to protect some of our most important habitats. So there's far fewer national nature reserves than there are SSSI'S, but they are areas that are of land that are sort of deemed to be among the best examples of a particular habitat, and they are usually owned by local authorities. There's about 221 national nature reserves in England, which cover over 100,000 hectares, essentially, and local examples would be somewhere like Lee Woods or Gordano Valley. So they often cover much larger areas than maybe a SSSI would. So now moving into that international ban. So the two of these, the special area of conservation and the special protection areas, they sound nice and helpfully similar, but they're really the similar sort of protection, but for two different groups of animals. And these two, the SAC and the SPA, are inherited from our time in the EU. So they are instituted by the Habitats Directive, whereas the RAMSAR sites, RAMSAR actually just refers to the city in Iran where the international sort of treaty on wetlands was signed. But yeah, starting at SAC, Special Area of Conservation, this is for rare, vulnerable and endangered European protected species and habitats that are considered important for biodiversity. Of course, this generally includes rare or notable habitats, and a local example might be the Avon Gorge as an SAC, where we have white beam trees, Bristol and Bristol rock cress that can only be found in that Avon Gorge. They're totally endemic to the area, so they can't be found anywhere else. There's also other sort of really notable species with various bats and peregrine falcons known to breed there. Whereas smaller areas, not as sort of vast as the Avon Gorge, can also be designated as an SAC, but be spread over a much wider area. So if you look up the Mendip Bats SAC, you'll see that's actually looks really fragmented, and that's because it specifically covers the caves in which there are known bat roosts or the bats are known to use them. So yeah, that's more of a mosaic of smaller areas. Whereas the SPA, very similar, that EU level of protection, but specifically for rare, vulnerable and migratory birds. So the sort of legal way it functions is very similar to an SAC, but specifically they are to those sort of migratory birds and the breeding habitat specifically, which hopefully will become a bit clearer as well when we do the layering exercise in a moment. And yeah, finishing off on RAMSAR sites. In the UK, SPAs often really closely follow the same outlines as RAMSAR sites. But if we didn't have those SPAs, then RAMSAR site fills that gap for other countries that don't have the same protections as us. So RAMSAR sites can be found all over the world, and they are designated for wetlands of international importance. If you know much about wetlands, they can be really important for they are incredibly important for migratory birds, but also they can form really important nurseries for marine mammals, turtles, rare and endangered fish species, sharks. So yeah, as I mentioned, there's a lot of overlap between SPAs and RAMSARs, but RAMSAR sites you will find all over the world. So now, frustratingly for me, and maybe for you if you decide to do a bit of your own sort of research on this, local wildlife sites or county designated wildlife sites, like sites of nature conservation interest, they are designated by local councils, so they can change over time. So you have to look up your local council's map, essentially. So unfortunately, I am being Bristol biased here just because it feeds nicely into my following slides. But here you can see sort of the whole Avon Gorge is highlighted blue, and then that Lee Woods area, and then over on sort of Sea Mills Way as well. And then it snakes all the way along the Avon Cut right in the centre, and then comes all the way down to sort of this sort of, my eyes aren't working well, yeah, Hannam and Keynsham, Salford area. So all of these blue highlighted areas represent different sites of nature conservation interest designated by Bristol Council. Whereas if we were to go onto the Bath and North East Somerset website, they have their own map. So to look up your local wildlife sites, you have to go on your local council's website, or maybe even do a freedom of information request if your council isn't quite as high tech as our ones in Avon. But then moving on to the national designations, that's why this map has changed, because there is a website called Magic Maps, which is a multi-organisational map software run by the government, where you can see the whole network of sites across the whole country, which I'm not going to go into now. But if you are interested in that, that's going to come into I'm going to touch on it again next week in our Managing Sites for Wildlife talk. But also, if you're signed up to do our in-person ecology morning at Grow Wilder, I think that's the 1st of February, then we're going to do a deep dive on this, how to use the websites, how to research your sort of local notable species, and how to sort of form your own personal action plan for your area. So yeah, back on track. This map shows our local nature reserves, so those sort of county/national sites that have been designated and are under partial government control as well as local control, but are noted on that sort of national map. We then have our national nature reserves, which unfortunately in this map, it annoyingly doesn't show any. Just south of the Avon Gorge SSSI here, you would see the Lee Woods National Nature Reserve. But yeah, all of these blue sort of turquoise stripes here represent SSSI. So we've got Cattybrook, brick pits up sort of in the middle towards the sort of right there. Catty Brook is that's a site I know that's designated for its geological interest as opposed to sort of species specific. Whereas if you go to Lawrence Weston Moor here, they also have a SSSI there, I think designated mainly for water voles and possibly otter. And then we've also got the Gwent Levels up here, Magor and Undi, and we also include a lot of these sort of intertidal mudflats. If we add sites of special areas of conservation in there, that covers the entire estuary, and that is going to be because it includes the eels and the shad and the different fish species. It will also include any mammals and sort of amphibians and any other of those European protected species that can be found along these really important intertidal mudflats and floodplain grazing marsh areas. And then SPA. So the SPA, if I go back and forward there, you can see it appears essentially over the same area as the SSSI's, but it's that dotty one that's appearing. Again, that's because if we were not the UK with our SSSI mechanism, the European Union would still institute that area with legislation to protect it. But because in the UK, we do a really good job of doubling up those things and making sure it's sort of double bolt protected, that's why they have that overlap. And then we've included RAMSARs there as well. So you can see the RAMSAR site sort of appears over that same area there. And that really just hammers home the international importance of that area of the Severn Estuary. That means we've got internationally migratory birds and internationally important sea life living there. So if you were to do work in those areas, there would be a lot more species that you'd have to consider. So, other legislation for UK wildlife. Luckily for you guys, I'm not going to go into every single one of these bits of legislation, but I just included this just to show that there are many other laws in the UK to protect our wildlife from damage and exploitation, and some of them are really old. I'm expecting a pity laugh from at least half of you, because I've included a picture of a chough here, not only because they're beautiful seabirds, but to highlight that the seabird legislation in the UK, which was established in 1869, is some of our earliest wildlife protection to exist. And I also added it because we've had a chough and a lot of acronyms, and I thought you deserved a nice bird photo. Ha, 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 ha. Okay. Alongside that, we've got the Wildlife and Countryside Act that I've been mainly referring to today as our national legislation. Protection of mammals, meaning you can't just go out there and harm a wild mammal that you come across. Protection of birds, marine mammals, that's going to cover our sort of cetaceans, our whales, our porpoises that use the channel. And then also the Wildlife and Countryside Act has got its own schedule of invasive non-native species. So instead of protecting those species, those are species that it's illegal to allow to spread and sort of propagate into the wild. That'll include your Himalayan balsam, your Japanese knotweed, these sorts of really sort of vigorous non-native plants that cause a lot of economic and ecological damage. I'm going to we've only got a few more minutes of me talking at you, and I'm just going to wrap up and give an honorary mention here to community nature reserves. They're not legally recognised. So I don't want to confuse you and sort of say you can create your own local community nature reserve and that can get legal protection. At the moment in the UK, we don't have a legal mechanism for recognising community nature reserves. But community nature reserves are a collaborative effort locally to create wildlife habitats across a whole neighbourhood. So that could just be a few houses in a street. It could be houses across many streets. It could be a whole sort of area like in South Bristol where there's a Bedminster and is it Wider Bedminster or Upper Bedminster Community Nature Reserve? And essentially, they are a local effort to create habitats, including spaces like private residential gardens. They could be allotments or window boxes, even just grass verges or public open spaces. And the goal is to create a mosaic of wildlife-friendly areas in an urban setting to create a larger network that allows wildlife to sort of move safely between these areas. So whilst community nature reserves can support protected and notable species in an area, they aren't formally designated, but some councils in Avon do recognise and support community nature reserves as community projects that they want to actively support. So I'm just going to give a little shout out to one of our community nature reserves we're working with in Warmley. So I don't know if we've got anybody from Warmley or that sort of area on the call at the moment. If you have, give us a little wave. And if you're part of Warmley Action Nature Zone, actually, and you'd like to just say a little 5 minutes about it, that would be cool. But just to summarise, Avon Wildlife Trust has been working with the South Gloss Local Authority and existing community groups to support the creation and running of this community nature reserve. And currently there's 95 households that have signed up to participate. And I think the project was only launched this year, or maybe the very start of this year. And we have plenty of resources on our plenty of websites on our Could tell I've been talking for 45 minutes now. Plenty of resources on our website to help people if they want to look into setting up their own community nature reserve or get involved with an existing one. So if you're curious, just search Team Wilder Community Nature Reserves and have a look on our website, but we'll include that on the link with the notes at the end. Probably we'll send it out tomorrow. So thanks for your time. Thanks for your attention. And we can go to any questions.
We have some really great ones in the chat. Thanks so much, Amy. That was really great, and great to see the questions coming through. I might read them out, and then if there's anything else you want to say, then I can unmute you to elaborate on your question. Cool. So there was a question asking whether there's a resource where you can search by species to see what designations they have.
Yeah, so that would be incredibly helpful. And unfortunately, I'm not aware of like species-based search engine, but there are ways that you can look up different species to understand whether or not they are under certain protections. So I mentioned about the Wildlife Countryside Act and the Habitats Directive. Those legislations, you can just search the name of the legislation and maybe protected species, and you can find PDFs on the internet that will list all of the species that come under that, and they do group them by sort of birds, invertebrates, mammals, things like that. Another alternative would be to send an inquiry to your local environmental record centre. This does cost a little bit of money, so it's something that if you're a bigger community group, it's definitely worth doing. But as an individual, you probably wouldn't fork out sort of between £90 and £150, depending on the resource centre. But when you do that, your local environmental record centre will send you all of the records that they have for whatever radius search area that you've asked them for within that county. So I can pop some notes in the stuff that we share about that, how to find your local record centre in Avon, the former county of Avon. We use a record centre referred to as BREC, which is the Bristol Regional Environmental Record Centre. And they've got like an inquiry process where you can send the location and they'll give you the records. But alternatively, that you just have to sort of do a bit of digging, really. If you want to look at birds, you might look at the special protection area lists, or you might look at the Birds of Conservation Concern Red List. So it is one of those where you probably want to know more about the species you're looking up. But if you just want to know what species, notable species, have been registered in your area, then you can use a free resource called the National Biodiversity Network Atlas. Again, the NBN Atlas, sorry for the extra acronym, is a free online resource where you can search around a certain search area on a location, and it will tell you all of the historical records in that area. The only problem with the NBN Atlas is that it's not updated sort of anywhere near as rapidly as your local record centre. So it could be a year or two behind. And sometimes it can have really, really old results that if you don't go through every single one, it might be a bit misleading, because you might see, oh, there's 4 otters in my local area. But then when you actually open the records, one of the records is from like 1894 and another one's from 1920. So the likelihood of those otters still being in your local river is very low. So yeah, Alex has just shared a link to the NBN Atlas. And again, if you do come to our in-person ecology day, that's another one of the resources that I'm going to go through in a bit more depth to show people how to use. But yeah, I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And I've put the link to the Ecology Day in the chat as well if anyone wants to sign up to that. There was another question about development. So there seems to be more development planned in our area. Are there experts in biodiversity net gain about, or how do you become an expert in that?
Yeah, so biodiversity net gain is a really new legal function of our planning system. I also want to put a little disclaimer sort of for myself and for my colleagues in Avon Wildlife Trust, that whilst the Wildlife Trust is, so of course our priority is species and habitat protection and the support of healthy, rich, biodiverse green spaces for people to enjoy and interact with, we don't actually have a planning officer funded within our charity at the moment. It is something we recognise we'd really love to have, but unfortunately, because of that capacity, we have to be kind of really pick the planning applications that we do have a formal response on. So on our website, we've got formal responses to sort of Brislington Meadows and to the Yew Tree Farm planning development. But yeah, the one that if you're referring to Pill, I'm not personally familiar, but unfortunately with biodiversity net gain, if you want an expert, you may have to pay sort of a private ecological consultancy, because they're the ones that have got the legal protection through their insurances to do all of the sort of relevant calculations. But it's not impossible to do your own biodiversity net gain calculations. It's just there's some courses you can go on. You could look at the Field Studies Council, or you could just look at Ecology Training UK. If you just sort of look for ecology training courses in biodiversity net gain, if you wanted to personally train, then there are courses available, absolutely. It's quite like a technical subject, so it might take quite a while to get your teeth into it. I got out of the private ecology sector just as it was coming in, and I've managed to sort of dodge it in my own career, but with understanding I will have to get my own head around it. But yeah, it's numbers based and area calculations and things like this. So yeah, if you'd like a professional biodiversity net gain report, you may want to contact an ecological consultancy.
And then also, Amy, kind of also relating to planning, someone also said that there's a lot of talk in the news about best places for new housing, and they're asking if you could explain the difference between green belt, green field, brown field, and brown belt. We could always follow this up with an email if you don't feel you have time now. And is there a best option for wildlife out of those?
Yeah, so again, we could do a whole presentation on this, because I love sort of looking into the minutiae of how we define habitats and what we consider important. Just as a really whistle-stop tour, I also will another disclaimer, in ecology, there are very much 100 ways to string the same bow. So my interpretation of things may be slightly different to other ecologists, but my interpretation of green field versus brown field is that a green field is one that has never been developed on previously, and a brown field is one that has previously received development, whether that's hard standing or it's been concreted, or it's been used as a car park or whatever, as opposed to sort of a more virgin habitat. That doesn't mean that a greenfield site is going to be biologically richer than a brownfield. That greenfield site might literally just be a heavily mown field that's received a lot of fertilizer and has just 2 species of grass, maybe even 1 species of grass, versus maybe a derelict building site in the city centre that's been untouched for 80 years and has got lots of interesting, calcareous plants that have colonized over the years. So it doesn't mean that one is better or worse, but generally, and also green belt is tricky because green belts were designated more to prevent the expansion of urban centres rather than specifically as a landscape designation. That's why I've not actually included them in the presentation. And yeah, green belts were, I think it was in the Victorian era. They're quite an old approach, and I think not every city in the country has one, or not every town has one. But yeah, they were initially put in to stop expansion of cities. And I guess you would have to look at each proposed area and look at the quality of the habitat that's there before you decide what's more or less appropriate, because maybe retaining an old brownfield site because it's started hosting rare butterflies and beautiful sort of rock cresses may be more valuable than actually turning a unproductive arable field into housing. So it really is case by case. Sorry, I can't give a better response on that one.
No, thanks, Amy. And then we've got 2 questions from Peter, one which you answered when Peter went for a break, which was, can you get a copy of the SSSI seasonal activity chart? Do you want to answer that one quickly?
Yeah, so that one, I can share a link to that one specifically, but if you just search protected species survey calendar, loads of different consultancies and councils will have created them to help people understand the seasonal calendar. And there might be another one that you'll find that one there, but there may also be other designs that you find a bit more usable, or ones that focus more on different species. So if you just search protected species survey calendar, you'll get lots of different responses.
And the second question there was, when you were looking at that mapping and how you were doing the overlaying layers, are you able to link in or talk to sets of Bristol water data maps that show wildlife and possible wildlife corridors?
So that, as far as I'm aware, doesn't currently exist. However, you could use a couple of different resources that exist. So on that mapping software that I was using, Magic Maps, which we'll include a link to in the chat, but we'll also go into in more detail in future talks, you put on different sort of layers of the map that will highlight those green spaces or highlight known waterways. So I think it's the Ordnance Survey colour map that will highlight all known ponds, rivers, tributaries, streams, anything like that. So that's helpful for looking at water bodies. Wildlife corridors is more of an intuitive understanding. So you really need to look at the map, but also the habitat that's there, because you might see on a map there's a beautiful, strip of woodland, and then you go there and every 50 meters they've got a big sort of chain link fence dividing it up into the relevant landowners, which means that a lot of that wildlife can't move through that space. And then what was the last bit? Wildlife corridors. Oh yeah, I'll shout out the Bristol Avon Rivers Trust, who have got a river portal, which I think I saw Kai on here. And Kai, you upload data to that, don't you? I won't put you on the spot, but I'll send a link to that also. They have a great portal that's built off of citizen science, which is all about water testing. And I think either they do or they're planning to also publish the species results that they get from the species testing, the eDNA testing that they're doing. So yeah, exactly what you're asking for doesn't technically exist, but you could definitely do a bit of investigating and piece those things together.
Yeah, awesome. And I think, like you said, Amy, we will cover that mapping software in a bit more detail if you are able to come to future sessions. So that might be something we can explore. We're in the kind of last few minutes, but there's a couple more questions about like species specific ones. So one question is, does the Protection of the Mammals Act include rats?
Ooh, you'll have to check. I believe that the protection. Oh, that's difficult because I know that there's a couple of grey areas that I personally am not super well versed in, you know, about how, like, if you catch it, I think it's illegal to, no, it's not illegal. I think whenever you dispatch an animal, so whenever you take, I'm thinking in terms of, like, you know, when they could do grey squirrel control or mink control, when you're dispatching the animal, you have to have the right licenses and qualifications to show that you're not just sort of like going out with a gun and shooting animals willy-nilly. You have to have certain licenses to say that you can use the right size gun that's appropriate and you can dispatch that animal in the quickest way to reduce pain by all reasonable methods. So I couldn't tell you about that, but that's a really good question. I will have a look. I'll research it and we'll pop it in our notes that we send out to everybody.
Yeah, we can look into that. And this one, I don't know as well, Amy, if you know off the top of your head, or we can send it out afterwards, of what are hare populations like locally?
Oh, just before we go on to hares, I've also had a think. Brown rats are native to the UK, but black rats are a Norwegian, like, internationally spread species that I think, I'm not going to say stuff I don't know, but I would hypothesize that maybe it's the black rats that are more classified as vermin and the brown rats that are more of a native species that coexist with our existing species. But I'm freestyling. Don't quote me on that. We will do some research and include it in the notes. And regarding hares, yeah, European hares are protected by our legislation as a European protected species. I'm just going to double check that. I think hares are. Let's have a look. Oh no, they're a notable species. The European hare is a notable species in the UK, so they are protected under the Wildlife Countryside Act, but they do not receive international legislation. And again, that'll be due to their British population spread being very different to that of the continent. And I don't know who asked what they are.
That
Sorry,
was based in Bath.
in Bath. Oh yeah. That's something that you could definitely research on NBN Atlas, or by reaching out to Breck and asking what the sort of regional distribution or abundance would be like. I know driving around South Bath, I've seen 2 hares before. So they're definitely there, but I don't know what the population would be like. And I think I just saw somebody corrected my terrible hypothesizing about rats. Brown rats are not native and black rats are now very rare. Great. Okay, that's really helpful to know. I'm going to stop freestyling information in that case, and I'm just going to do the research and include the correct information.
Yeah, and just very quickly before we end, I wanted to flag Mike shared that he's been setting up a community nature reserve in the last 12 months at the edge of Bath, and has included a link to that, which is really nice.
Brilliant. Nice.
And I know someone else in this call has been involved in setting up a nature reserve, a community nature reserve in Frampton Cotterell as well. So it's just really, really nice to see that community nature reserve sort of spirit really taking off. So Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing that.
Yeah, and by creating those community nature reserves where there's that designated commitment to people improving habitats, creating habitats, and monitoring species that are present, actually by recording the species that you do see on site, particularly if you see European protected species or notable species, and submitting them to your local council, sorry, not your local council, your local environmental record centre, can actually be really helpful in contributing to those local plans. So, for example, if you do know that there's a huge hare population and, you know, 7 bats that occupy that area, reporting that means that when that local plan is reviewed, those records will be taken into account. It doesn't guarantee that they'll be protected, but they will be taken into account.
Yeah.
Because we've got to 7 now, shall I pop my email address in the chat? And if anybody's got outstanding questions, they're more
there's I think one outstanding, which is a really good question about kind of what kind of wildlife lives in different areas and how to encourage wildlife. So we can definitely kind of include some resources about that in a follow-up email. But
I think in that case, you'd look at historically what's been present and then work towards re-establishing that, because it's hard to know what's been removed whether that's, you know, cleared in the 50s or bombed or, you know, whatever's happened to a space. But if you can see that, you know, 20 years ago there were otters, or 40 years ago there was twice as many bats, then you know that those are the species that once relied on that area, and you can then look up the habitats that those animals need and then cater towards that. So you might cater towards putting more bat boxes up and planting the food species of the moths that bats feed on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. But we'll follow this up with more resources in the recording. Just a big thank you for spending your evening with us. And if you go on the Avon Wildlife Trust Eventbrite page, you can check out all the other events. And the in-person Ecology Day one isn't on there because it's still a private link, but I've put it in the chat and we can follow that up in an email if you did want to sign up to that. But yeah, thank you very much. Feel free to log off. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks, Amy, as well. That was amazing.
No worries. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming along to our first one, and hopefully we might see you at future ones. And have a lovely evening. Thanks for your time. Bye.